Joy.
I hope this one's on too. Can you hear me okay? Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Sanger. I consider myself an eco-queer scholar and artist. I'm doing a PhD in anthropology at UCL, and I teach dance theory and practice at Roehampton University. Um, Thank you. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan, and my research is focused on the intersections of somatic practice, queer theory, ecology, performance, and ritual. I'm going to share a little bit of a talk today about enchantment, which is some of the early phases of my research. But something I've picked up over the year, this past year, is that you can pay attention to things without staring at them, and it can be really hard to stare at people. So if you want to rest your eyes or look in different directions, I know you're still listening to me. It can be really hard to fully zone in on something. So if while I'm speaking, or if other people feel while they're speaking, if you need to look away or close your eyes and just listen, that's perfectly fine. But my PhD asks how dance might be considered an ecological practice, specifically within the context of dance artists and choreographers located within the United Kingdom. This project is mainly focused on looking at ideas of perception, rhythm, community, and ideas about what the word nature means. I'm particularly interested in the term enchantment and how dance practices affect our perception of ourselves and the world around or within us. This term brings up many questions. What does it mean to be enchanted? What does it mean to be disenchanted? Is modernity inherently disenchanting? And is re-enchantment a sort of naive romanticism? And then why does this all even matter? Despite, or perhaps because of, all of these slippery questions, I find enchantment a useful way to think about and trouble ideas of agency and relationality. Relationality has already come up in multiple people's prophecies and sharings today, so it feels quite apt. But where we locate agency, or the ability to act with intention, and how we relate to each other and the rest of the world is essential to understanding and confronting the multiple crises of the 21st century. For political theorist Jane Bennett, well enchanted, we sense that we are always mixed up with it, and it shares in some of the agency we officially ascribe only to ourselves. She argues that a sense of enchantment may be valuable for ethical life on this ravaged planet. In this short talk, I'll briefly introduce ideas of disenchantment and re-enchantment in response to tonight's theme, After the Flood. This story of enchanting forces begins with a modern tale of disenchantment. And this particular disenchantment tale traces its origin story from the Enlightenment era and the advent of capitalism onto this crisis of modernity. But I emphasize that this is only a tale, retold and disseminated through time. And I also question if characterizing the world as disenchanted first ignores and then discourages affective attachment to the world, thus therefore reproducing the exact conditions it decries. Enlightenment thinkers such as Francis Bacon, Calvin Hobbes, and René Descartes founded and advocated for pillars central to modern life, including empiricism, the scientific method, social contract theory, private property, and the separation of mind and matter. Feminist scholar Silvia Federici writes at length on the origin of these ideas and the subjugation of women, the body, and nature, alongside the vilification of occult practices as essential to the foundation of early capitalism. Capitalism demanded that nature and the body be predictable, controllable, mechanized for maximum efficiency and productivity. The body therefore becomes reduced from a receptacle of potent energies and powers into an automaton of gears, levers, processes, and systems. This reconfiguration of the body and nature left no room for magic. The capitalist future demanded a disenchanted world. Hobbes is quoted in Leviathan writing, "As for witches, I think not that their witchcraft is any real power, but yet that they are justly punished, for the false belief they have that they can do such mischief, joined with their purpose to do it if they can. If such superstitions were eliminated, men would be much more fitted than they are for civil obedience. Therefore, in the eyes of these thinkers, eradication of these practices was a necessary condition for the capitalist rationalization of work. Why are these practices not dangerous anymore? Why is the herbalist, the acupuncturist, the astrologist, the medium ridiculed but not criminalized? Because the work is already done. Even the most devout reader of horoscopes checks his watch before leaving the house to go to work. We are already fully ensconced in that worldview. This disenchantment tale takes us next to Max Weber's 1918 lecture, where he described the chief features of modernity, namely intellectualization, secularization, rationalization, and bureaucracy, as the primary disenchanting forces. He used disenchantment to define the loss of magic, mystery, and the inability of science to answer the universal question, what shall we do and how shall we live? He lamented the flight of sublime values from the public domain and the dispelling of the inherent mystery of natural processes, redefining them as conquerable and manipulable by mankind. Ooh, we've got a dog too somewhere. 20th century anti-moderns decry disenchantment as the aggressive secularization of a formerly intact teleological worldview. They argue that the expulsion of religion, the afterlife, and ritual performance from the public domain created a world devoid of purpose. This loss of purpose, they say, created the disenchanted, nihilistic modern man. With these various tales in mind, who do we have to blame for the loss of magic? Science, religion, secularism, capitalism, and what exactly is this sense of enchantment that we've lost? Just as there are various tales of disenchantment, so too are there tales of enchantment. Federici locates re-enchantment as rooted in the commons through their ability to present alternatives to capitalist societies. Anthropologist Alfred Gell locates enchantment in the power of man-made art objects to fascinate, compel, and confuse spectators via the virtuosity and craft of their creators. However, Timothy Morton argues that experiencing wonder or beauty, be it through art or through the landscape, requires a bit of a mind meld with at least one thing that isn't you. He says, we coexist, we are in solidarity, I'm haunted, charmed, enchanted, under a spell. This particular form of enchantment describes the method by which destabilization between subjects and objects occurs. The feeling of being charmed or enchanted is a consequence of the object enacting upon the perceiver. Jane Bennett says then that to be enchanted is to be struck and shaken by the extraordinary that lives amid the familiar and the everyday. To be enchanted then is to participate in a momentarily immobilizing counter. It is to be transfixed, spellbound, a moment of pure presence. It is to be simultaneously transfixed in wonder and transported by sense, to be both caught up and carried away. With these definitions in mind, enchantment becomes an experience of wonder, a diffusion of self and other and world. It becomes an acknowledgement of the agency and vitality of matter. Bennett and others argue that experiences of enchantment matter because they may inspire an ethical, ecological sensibility, that one must be enamored with existence in order to be capable of donating some of one's scarce mortal resources to the service of others. How might we dance while enamored with existence? How might we use our practice in service to others, both human and non-human? But this isn't the only picture of enchantment. In other interpretations, enchantment suggests a hierarchy. Someone or something is doing the enchanting, casting the spell, or someone and something is being enchanted. There is an inherent unequal power dynamic at play. Mark Fisher argues that capitalism is what is left when beliefs have collapsed at the level of ritual or symbolic elaboration, and all that is left is the consumer spectator, trudging through the ruins and the relics. Yet at the same time, capitalism also requires an overvaluing of belief. He says, so long as we believe in our hearts that capitalism is bad, we are free to continue to participate in capitalist exchange. We believe that money is only a meaningless structure of no intrinsic worth, yet we act as if it has a holy value. We are able to fetishize money in our actions only because we have already taken an ironic distance towards money in our heads. This double act signifies a capitalist realism that seamlessly occupies the horizons of the thinkable, that has colonized the dreaming life of the population, and is so taken for granted that it is no longer worthy of comment. As Margaret Thatcher said, there is no alternative. How can a worldview so pervasive, so inescapable, not be a sort of spell? What other than a hex, a veil, a glamour can so thoroughly scuttle our imaginations and bodies? In the Book of Trespass, Nick Hayes argues that notions of private property, coupled with the fences and forces that contain and refuse access to land, also act as spells. Spells of an old paternalistic order that tell us everything is just as it should be. Hayes writes that when this spell is shattered, the first response is often anger. He describes cars on London roads as generating the spell of capitalism, and when Extinction Rebellion blocked these roads and bridges and reclaimed the city, they brought the plain truth of the climate crisis into the public sphere. They were derided, they were called middle-class narcissists and defined as radicals hell-bent on anarchy. Such hysteria is the sound of the spell breaking. What immense power do our bodies hold to fracture these world-subjugating spells merely through acts of trespass and the obstructions of borders and pathways? And yet, as difficult as it may be to see beyond this particular hex, Bennett argues that enchantment is not the exclusive domain of oppressive capitalist forces, nor pre-modern society. She argues that enchantment never truly left the world, it only changed forms. She finds enchantment in the writings of Thoreau, Latour, and Kafka, where the categories of nature and culture become anachronistic, our modern world populated with limitless crossings, cyborgs, assemblages, and hybrids. She also locates enchantment in matter itself, in chemical and molecular systems far from equilibrium, basically any environment not strictly controlled, in a laboratory. Supported by the work of Isabel Stengers, she demonstrates how some chemical solutions can react to form two possible new stable solutions, but no mathematical equation can predict which one will emerge. There is an unpredictability no improvement in knowledge or measurement is likely to overcome. Much as some atomic particles behave differently when observed, the very makeup of the universe is astonishing, wonderful, enchanting. Matter itself is both sacred and vibrant. We've gone through three different forms of enchantment: a neo-romanticist view of pre-capitalist worlds, the spellbinding haze of capitalism itself, and the truly wondrous, complex world supported by contemporary physics and philosophy. Perhaps it's time then for a re-examination of enchantment. We find ourselves presented with a complex contemporary zeitgeist in which we were never truly modern and magic was never really dispelled. Yet we simultaneously acknowledge the disenchantment of living in a world ravaged by the neoliberal telos of eternal economic growth. It is hard to deny the loss of magic, the cementation of singular bounded energy entities, and the image of the self-made man that dominated the 20th century. Navigating this world is difficult and often lonely. However, current trends in the natural and social sciences have proven the concepts of organism, species, and individual just as mythic as the gods we banished. The glamour is being lifted. Now what? What structures, what spells, what worldviews will we advocate? Perhaps the way to resist the enchantment of capitalism is to strengthen the enchantment of the wondrous complexity of life, to fight enchantment with enchantment, to infuse oneself with the effective energy of a more life-affirming mood, and to cultivate a generous disposition in oneself by drawing sustenance from the rich abundance of nature culture. But what does this mean for dance and dancers? Bennett argues that some experiences enchant for the same reason that moving one's body in space can carry one away. Think of dancing or the quick intake of breath and the rush after a hard push on a swing. For Bennett, enchantment can be an intensely somatic experience, and she likens it to the feelings that arise while dancing. Dancers, then, must be skilled conjurers of enchantment whether we are aware of it or not. Moving the body in space can be a radical, pleasurable act of communion between yourself and the world. Federici describes dance as essential to the reappropriation of our bodies from the mechanizing force of capitalism. She says, from dance we learn that matter is not stupid, it is not blind, it is not mechanical, but has its rhythms, its language, and is self-activated and self-organizing. The body mediates and translates all experience. It is through the body that we navigate the polyphonic world and how we make sense of it. What better way to rediscover the body's capacity for resistance, celebrate and expand its powers than through dance? We've experienced a great rupture of the systems we used to precariously rely on. We've survived in the fractures along fault lines and liminal spaces. The glamours that constructed our perception of normal have faded. There is a real danger that the wreckage after this flood could give rise to reactionary populist authoritarianism, but there's also an opportunity to participate in the weaving of an enchantment that inspires joy and wonder in the everyday, celebrates the sublime in the mundane, and expands the isolated I into an entangled, synergetic us. I don't have the answers. These are just questions, provocations. This is just a story including both disenchantment and enchantment tales. But stories are spells that change the way we experience the world. Therefore, it matters what stories we tell, what dances we make, and what spells we cast. Thank you.
Thank you, that was great. Has anybody got any questions that you'd like to put? Any observations, either again, our online audience or here to Andrew at all? Yes, Lucy.
Is your work online and accessible? Can you go to the mic?
Yeah.
Sorry, otherwise
Sorry.
Is your work online and accessible?
Not yet.
Okay.
Hopefully soon. I'm in the very early stages, so it should be finished in about 2 to 3 years. We'll see how that goes.
Can I grab your email or something with that work? Can I take your email?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Email,
Yeah.
Instagram, whatever you want. There'll be time to mingle.
Okay. Cool. Okay. Thank you.
Lovely.
I guess we're using the mic, yes. I think it's to do with our online friends so we can all hear each other.
I just wanted to know your form of expression of dance. Like what theme is it? How do you express it?
So my personal practice with this experience so far ends up being a lot of outdoor somatic work. But I find that doing it in groups is also very important. So I'm following the work of dance makers including Helen Poyner and Sandra Reeve and Simon Whitehead and these kind of pioneers in this sort of ecological movement practices. But for myself, it's become far less performative and much more about the practice. My own personal sort of artistic practice in this, I'm really interested in naming as a way of enchanting the world. On a sort of semi-performative practice, I'm just going for a walk and naming every sort of plant, animal, bird that I can, names that I know, names that may be scientific, or names that I make up on the spot, or names that come from storybooks. But that sort of acknowledging and the sort of practice of naming while I'm walking, I feel becomes a sort of enchanting performative practice in its own sort of way. But it is also like in movement. It's while walking, but it's not necessarily a dance. But like, it's sort of embodied presence.
That's a really interesting way to broaden like how people would then define like dancing like in the center and to like put your arms all around and everything.
Yeah, it does feel like dancing, even though I'm just walking. But it becomes a sort of internal dialogue that is embodied in a certain way, like recalling stories or recalling memories or just acknowledging different beings and whatever that means.
Cool.
Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Oh, lovely. Sorry, I couldn't.
And my mic's working.
Yeah, no, I can hear you now.
And my dog was talking earlier.
It's okay.
Well, I think that you actually started to answer this question a bit. When I listen to the word enchantment, I often think about stories. And so I guess, and you were sort of mentioning this with the practice of naming.
Like
that
a
as you were
sci-fi
walking,
film, isn't it, where they're talking to sort of Earth
you're
or
naming.
something, on their sort of screens in the
Can
spaceship.
you mute?
Yeah, well, she's online, you see, she's not there.
No, but that's what I'm saying. It's a bit
Excuse me,
like a sci-fi
can you
film.
mute?
Remember?
James, turn your microphone off.
Oh, it's James, is it?
Oh, sorry.
Can you repeat your question, please?
Yes.
Yeah, so just the role of stories and myth in the work that you're doing and how that intersects with movement and dance. Because the word enchantment tends to, it just, when you first started speaking, inspired me to think about myth and story, and it feels like all those things can be important elements of sort of the times that we're living in, and this whole idea of belief as both something we've lost as well as almost like a religion. So yeah, if anything around myth or story comes into your work.
It definitely does with regards to ideas of naming. Like myth and storytelling are often tales of names and tales of creating characters, and often have relationships to either people or plants or animals in the real world as well that kind of create myths themselves and all kinds of different cultural backgrounds. And in many sorts of movement forms, dancing is also a form of storytelling, in sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively. I think there's a deep connection there between myth making, between enchantment, and between movement. But I don't have an answer yet. That is one of the kind of the questions that I'm really interested in. And how can a movement practice become a myth making practice? And does it need to be narrative to be a myth? I don't know, but I think it's really important, these ideas of stories, and how stories can become embodied experiences and not just something we read in books. Not that reading in books is bad, but I think they can support each other in a lot of different ways. And I'm not trying to create a binary between the written and the moved. I think they're necessary in many different ways. But yes, I am thinking critically through these ideas of myth and story, and it was nice that you noticed that connection as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, your work is so exciting for me, and I love your questions about how movement and myth or story can blend together, and also creating stories without narrative is very interesting question. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions from either the floor or online? Well, I have one.
There's one here.
Oh, there's one here. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you. You know, go to the mic.
This is the last question.
Thank you. But the last question.
Thank you. I was wondering, what are the forms of dance, if you kind of studied them, that have sort of cemented the sort of the capitalist hex, as you called it, over time, over the last sort of century? Or do you feel like there are certain forms of movement and dance that really have, sort of exaggerated and codified in some ways that kind of that enchantment?
I haven't thought about this, and this is a great question. But yeah, how does dance reinforce those kind of hierarchical, oppressive forms of enchantment? I'm sure many of us have ideas in our head, and I don't want to offend anyone by saying any of those ideas in our head. But I think that's something that that I try to consider in my pedagogical approach. In how am I delivering this technique? Is it codified or not? And if it's codified, how do I make sure I'm teaching it in a way that doesn't put its book of what is right and wrong as better than anyone else's book of right and wrong, and how I can try to frame them as equal, that some things can be right in one form and wrong in another. But I think, you can find any sort of hyper sort of controlled or hyper commodified movement form as potentially enchanting in that particular way. But I think I would resist trying to label any dance form in that way, and perhaps more label the approach to teaching that form, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I'm still thinking through it on the spot with you.
No, that's cool. Carry on thinking.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
For your question.
Thank you. That's great.